back, listeners, to the BizBlend podcast with your host Sana, where business meets the personal and real conversations drive real change. Now, listeners, today's guest is Karen Ann Bulluck, and she's a former corporate executive who swapped boardrooms for bookshelves. Yeah, you heard that right. With two compelling novels and a third on the way, she writes about women navigating the sharp edge of leadership, where ethics, ambition, and identity collide. But listeners, Karen's journey is more than fiction. It is a reflection of her own bold pivot out of the corporate world. Her insights from coaching female leaders, her mission to explore the silent struggles many women face at the top. So, if you have ever questioned the cost of climbing the ladder or wondered what it really takes to lead with integrity, this conversation is for you. So, Karen, welcome to the show, and I'm really honored and excited to have you here with us.
Thank you much, Sana. I am really happy to be here. I love that I love that introduction. I love the way you pulled things together, and I can't wait to have our conversation.
Absolutely. Very interesting transition, Karen. Very bold for the fact from executive life to authoring fiction. I mean, our listeners would love to know. I would love to know that was there a turning point that told you that yes, it was time to leave the corporate world behind and then move into the world of writing books.
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure that there was one specific turning point, but for me, I think I got to the point in my career where I had accomplished, you know, my goals. I had accomplished what I set out to do, and I realized that continuing in the corporate world, while, certainly had its challenges and excitement and
Mm.
things that I loved about it, I felt there was another part of me that needed to be expressed that I really couldn't do in the corporate world, and that really was my creativity. I was an English major in college, so I've always loved writing and reading. I'm a passionate reader, and I felt like I needed to start exploring that other creative side of me, and that I really couldn't do it at the same time I was still in the corporate world.
Mm. That's really, really exciting. Really exciting, really inspiring as well, Karen. Because many listeners, our listeners, they are professionals and they are silently, craving a pivot. So your answer, might just be the nudge that they need. So thank you for sharing that, Karen. And now let's talk about your novels. So they center on ethical dilemmas women face in leadership. So why do you think these stories are so rarely told or discussed, especially in the mainstream business media?
Well, I think we like to think that the business world is ethical. We have this idea in our heads that we need to say that it is or feel that it is. But yet there's all these silent little tug of wars, I think, that go on with everyone in the business world, but particularly with leaders and women leaders, where yes, things you've gotta get things done. Yes, the business has to make a profit, all of those things. And I don't discount that in any of my novels because obviously if a business isn't making money, it's not gonna be in business very long.
Mm.
But there's also the side of the cost. You mentioned this in the intro. What's the cost of
Mm.
getting things done? What's the cost to us personally of succeeding, having to make those tough decisions? One of the things that you learn very early on in leadership is that you've got to make tough decisions, and you do. I mean, there's no question about that. But at some point, some of the tough decisions start to cross a line for some people, and they start to become something that sucks at your soul versus something that supports and uplifts you. And I think that's one of the things that I love to explore in this. Where is that line for women leaders? Uh, particularly, the characters in my books. The main character's name is Cheryl, and in the first book, she struggles with, for instance, the company does a bunch of layoffs, and they don't necessarily handle it in a way that most of us would like. How does she deal with that? What does she do? What does she do to reconcile this with her own conscience? And then how does she help her team navigate through the trauma of those kinds of layoffs? And that's the kind of thing that I love to explore because it's not straightforward. There's not easy answers. And in Cheryl's case, and in many of our cases, actually in the work world, we don't always get the support we need or want for those kind of dilemmas. People tell us, well, this is the way business is. And if you're going to be a leader, you need to suck it up and move on. And, you've got to put the business first. And, all of those things, and those are all true, right? Those are absolutely all true. But how do you balance it with the other side of things?
Mm. That is really once again, I think it's not much discussed, and we have seen firsthand, especially during pandemic, post pandemic as well. Um, and can you share any example from your books or maybe your personal experiences where maintaining integrity it actually came with a real cost?
Well, I think fortunately, and my books are inspirational, so sometimes they don't really necessarily have the cost. But in the case of Cheryl, she takes a real risk at a board meeting where she has to say no to some very powerful people in the industry and in her company. And in this case, it I will, give a sneak peek giveaway that it does work out,
Okay.
but there is a cost on the personal side of her life because her husband is not really on board with the direction that she's going.
Okay.
And so it actually creates a rift in her marriage more than it creates a problem in the workspace.
Okay.
But there are also lingering questions, and as the books are actually a series of 3, and I'm working on the 3rd one now, and as these a as this plays out in her career, the fact that she took a stand on some of these crucial ethical issues, in such a public way, in a board meeting, has created questions in the minds of some of the board members and some of the investors in the company of her fitness as a leader. And so it works out maybe the first time, but then there's this doubt in people's minds. Is she really the right person for this job? And there's a constant tension between her and some of her colleagues that support her and some of the people that think maybe she's not aggressive enough, she's not willing to make the tough decisions, that she's too soft on people, that she's not going to get things done. All of those things create lingering doubts, and she has to try to navigate that of staying true to her conscience, but still showing up in a way that the other people in leadership trust her and believe in her and know that she's going to actually do the right thing for the business too. And that's where a lot of as the story unfolds, that's where a lot of tension comes in. And in the 3rd book, y- you know, I think that's really going to come to a head
Mhm.
because investors are like, you know, no, you need to be what we want you to be, not who you're trying to be. And how that works out is going to be really interesting to see because I don't know yet.
I mean, yeah, it's a really complicated, frustrating scenario to deal with when a decision which is supposed to be taken, a decision or action supposed to be taken in a workplace, it is also um, directly or indirectly, determining the events in your personal life. It's such a dilemma, Karen. So, uh,
It really is.
uh, it is, and women. I mean, maybe it's a systemic or it's a cultural thing that we are uh, kind of taught to be to listen to everyone and not to say no to anyone, uh, because then they'll have wrong impressions about us, as you mentioned that others in the workplace will think that she's not the right fit in the leadership. So I think this is a very relevant, uh, practical daily life example.
It really is, and one of the things that I find very interesting and I explore in the books is that, that intersection of our personal lives and our professional lives, and I think for women in particular, that is a much bigger intersection than it often is for men. Men are and I'm generalizing here, and I'm not trying to say anything negative about men, but men are very good at compartmentalizing things and keeping everything in one bucket. Here's my business bucket, here's my personal bucket. And I know like a lot of the men I know are very, particularly my husband, for example, are very good at that compartmentalizing. And it serves a really valuable purpose for them. In fact, it makes things cleaner in many cases. But I think women, just by nature, and to your point, the way we're taught, have a much harder time separating those and keeping things in compartments. We tend to look at things more, as intertwined, and our personal and our professional lives weave together in ways sometimes that are very uncomfortable, and sometimes in ways that are very beneficial. So it depends on our situation and what's going on. But one of the things that I really find interesting is also relationships in the workplace, and the relationships between people. And I talk a little bit about that in the second book, where relationship between a man and a woman in that gets the lines get blurred in a not healthy way. But it happens, right? We joke about having our work wives or our work husbands, and that is a very real phenomenon in the workplace. And how do we navigate that without crossing lines? Because sometimes we're not getting the support we want at home, so we get it at the workplace, and then how does that work out? So
Mhm.
that's another thing that I find really interesting, because we need support. And I think as particularly as women, we're always looking for our support network, and which is great. And sometimes that support network is really hard to find.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you, Karen. And you also coach women leaders. So, from your experience and that, have you observed any patterns or blind spots consistently when it comes to ethical decision making?
I think one of the things that I've noticed most in coaching women is many women underestimate themselves.
Mm.
They feel like, and this is, we don't want to oversell ourselves as women. We want to make sure that we're, being honest, and we're not overselling ourselves. And in worrying about that, we often sell ourselves short. So I've
Mhm.
seen that with a lot of women. We don't acknowledge what we've really accomplished and what we're really bringing to the table. And I put that in the context of an ethical dilemma simply because I think one of the things that women, we don't want to lie. We don't want to tell people that we can do something that we can't. We don't want to let people down. To your point earlier, as we want to tell people yes, and we want to be part of the team, and we don't want to let anybody down. So we want to make sure that we're 100% sure and ready to do whatever it is that we're asked to do. And in doing so, we overlook our accomplishments and we underestimate them. And I've worked with a lot of women in trying to go back and really, okay, what have you accomplished? And how can you put these things together to understand that yes, you are ready for a bigger role. You are capable of doing a lot more. And it's always eye-opening when we go through the exercise of really writing down and looking at everything that women have accomplished. It's always eye-opening. They're like, "Wow, I've done a lot more than I thought I did." So we sell ourselves short, and I've seen that as a very consistent pattern with a lot of the women that I've coached and worked with. And once they take a look at it and they say, "Oh, wow, I'm really capable of a lot more," then they feel more confident in stepping into bigger roles and bigger positions and in saying putting their hands up and saying, "Yes, I can do this."
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then interestingly, I have had conversations on visibility when it comes to women in workplaces in the leadership positions, or whether in, discussing compensations or, considering themselves much deserving for that much awaited promotion. I think during those situations, it's really very essential to understand that what kind of true genuine value you are bringing to the table, and then also having that in the communication completely, to put it out across, that yes, I am capable of that, I have that knowledge, that capability, that talent required here. So yeah, you really hit the nail in that.
Yeah, and you have to raise your hand, and we're often taught not to raise our hands, that we're being too pushy, right? How many of us have been told you're being too pushy, you're being aggressive, and we'd like to think that some of that is changing, and I think some of it is changing, particularly in the younger generations.
Yeah.
I see a different perspective, but it still exists, and in some societies more than others as well. You know, it's more accepted in some cultures versus others. And that goes for both, the broader culture of the society that people are living within, or the culture of the company. Some companies are more open to it than others. And I think that's an important distinction to make.
Right. Hey, and before we conclude the conversation, Karen, as you write the final book in your trilogy, uh, what questions about power, gender, and authenticity are you still wrestling with? Especially with the current advancements, the current more and more open discussions around gender biasness or equality or inequality.
Well, the last book is based on the concept of trust and building trust, rebuilding trust when it's been broken. And so some of the things that I'm wrestling with is, women trusting themselves, right?
Mhm.
The kind of the conversation we were just having. The other thing that's really interesting and I'm wrestling with in the third book is the whole concept of how artificial intelligence is impacting leadership. And, I think that particularly for women, but I think, for everyone,
Mhm.
how do we keep the humanity in business, in our lives when, artificial intelligence, you hear all kinds of wild stories about how it's gonna replace everyone in the workplace and or 70% of jobs and, all these wild stories. And I'm not saying that they're not, eventually gonna be true. I have no idea. I can't predict the future, but as leaders, how do we wrestle with that? How do we keep humanity in the workplace? How do we keep the focus on humans, both internally and outside of the company, right? Because obviously, at the end of the day, customers are the lifeblood of any company. How do we keep the humanity in our societies and our businesses and everything, and still integrate the powerful capabilities that AI can bring to the table. And certainly, that's one of the things that a lot of leaders are struggling with these days. And one of the topics that I'm exploring in this third book, not to say that I'm having all the answers, but again, from an ethical standpoint, what are the right answers there? And are we considering a lot of the ethical questions around AI? Um, and there's a couple of the characters that are really going to, particularly the lead character, because her role is in IT, so she's really gonna be on the hot seat from that standpoint. Are you still there? Um, you can't see that.
Yeah. Karen, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean my Wi-Fi just got away for a few minutes.
I hate when that happens.
Anyway, so Karen, before we conclude the conversation, if our listeners they would like to connect with you and also get access to your trilogy, what would be the best way?
Well, LinkedIn is sort of my social media platform of choice. So you can find me under Karen Ann Bulluck or my company name, which is Daring to Transcend. Either one of those are ways you can find me, and you can always reach out to me at Karen at daringtotranscend.com, because I talk about daring to transcend in the concept of my books and my work, because it is a risk to
Is it
transcend. It is a risk to rise above what's going on, and I love to encourage women to take risks and to really take things to the next level.
absolutely, absolutely. Lovely. I'll make sure to have all the details in the show notes. And Karen, thank you for reminding us that not only titles or promotions they determine power, but it's more about the courage to ask better questions and also write or maybe rewrite your own rules. So thank you so much for the work you are doing.
Well, thank you, Sana, and that was a beautiful way to sum it up. I appreciate the work that you're doing because these conversations are really important to have.
Absolutely. And to all the listeners out there, especially women, whether you are leading a team, writing your own story, or wrestling with a tough choice right now, this conversation is a reminder that integrity is really easy, but it's always worth the risk. If Karen's words resonated with you, check out her novels. Stay tuned for the final installment of a trilogy. Just refer to the show notes along with this episode. Until next time, keep blending boldness with reflection right here on BizBlend. Thank you.